Steve Kim for UCN Live, and I'm here with my good friend, Larry Merchant, boxing sage. And Larry, I literally think you are the only person that I could think of that you were there March 8th, 1971, the fight of the century, Ali Frazier at the Madison Square Garden, and you're actually going to be there May 2nd when Mayweather fights Pacquiao finally. Have you thought about how lucky you are just with that distinction?
It's what I always wanted to do and kept wanting to do more of it. And so it's made me a senior kibitzer for this event.
Well, Larry, you are actually doing something with the event with Tecate with Sylvester Stallone. Explain that venture.
Well, it's me and Rocky talking about the fight. We had a long session about it in various aspects. He's very knowledgeable about prize fighting, and they chopped it up into smaller segments to help digitally support their sponsorship of the event.
Right, and for the record, you can go on the Tecate Facebook page or on YouTube, and all the segments are up there with Sly Stallone and Larry Merchant. Larry, let's go back to that historic event, March 8th, 1971. I think you've said this before. There will never be an event quite like that, will there?
No, it was a one of a kind because of the times it was in, all the social turmoil, Ali being a polarizing figure at the time, socially, politically, Joe Frazier being a popular heavyweight, both undefeated. Ali had been out of action for 3 years because of his, in effect, his opposition to Vietnam. The fight had been building for years, and here it was happening. And whether you lived in an igloo or a hut on a remote island, you knew that Ali Frazier was happening.
Mayweather-Pacquiao, we know that this will be the centerpiece of the sports world for at least 3 or 4 days. It's the fight everyone's wanted. Can this event, or does this event, compare in any way to Ali Frazier?
Well, they were heavyweight champions, and so it's really hard to compare that. And there are no big social, political implications in this event, just as there were previously when Joe Louis fought Max Schmeling in their rematch. But in the modern era of communications, it's a huge event that's going to set financial records. Will it be the event that we remember? That depends on the fight. There have been a lot of big events that have lived up to expectations, but many of them haven't.
Larry, that's the other thing that's bothersome when people say this is the biggest fight ever, May 2nd. Yeah, because of the money, because there's reportedly $300 million on the table. But then I draw the analogy, there's a lot of baseball players paid more than Ted Williams or Joe DiMaggio. It doesn't necessarily make them better. Do you think a lot of observers are mixing up the two dynamics?
Well, you know, it's a little self-serving for people in the media to keep saying it's the biggest, you know, and that requires a bigger headline and it requires your attention if you're not a boxing fan. Another analogy might be movies. Movies sometimes generate billions of dollars. Does it make the movie itself better than other movies? We're getting into quality, and what made Ali Frazier really memorable was the highest expectations possible, and the competition and the drama of the fight exceeded the expectations. That is the question now for going into the fight.
Larry, you talked about the social implications of Ali Frazier. Obviously, two guys were very polarizing, Ali and Frazier. But in this fight, though, would you draw the analogy that if you had to compare the two to those two heavyweights, Pacquiao would be Frazier, Floyd would definitely be Ali?
I think that's a way to look at it. I think that one difference is that Pacquiao is really the international figure in this fight. I mean, he has transcended oceans and borders and mountain ranges to be known all over the world. A figure who resonates around the globe. I don't know that Mayweather has, but Mayweather has done a tremendous job of marketing himself and of generating enormous amounts of money.
When you look at this event, every fight of the century that I can recall on my time on the beat, they always live down to the expectation. They're not that good. Why do you think that is?
Well, because promoters are basically salesmen. And there's no law against calling a fight the fight of the century. So, look, Leonard Hearns, Leonard Hagler, these were enormous events, and that lived up to all of the hopes and expectations. There have been some other fights that have. The last one of this dimension, the last couple I can think of might have been De La Hoya and Trinidad, which turned out to be an interesting and dramatic fight. And then there was Lennox Lewis and Tyson, which was not seriously competitive, but it ended on a dramatic note, a defining note for Lennox Lewis. So there are numbers of scenarios that could make it appealing and memorable to those who are willing to put the bucks up to see it.
Mm-hmm. Larry, another question about March 8th, 1970. When I hear all these stories about what a night that was, the way the people were dressed, the celebrities, I think Frank Sinatra was actually a ringside photographer because he wanted to secure his
Yes,
Philly.
I worked with Sinatra on that fight.
Well, that was your colleague. Yeah, you and old Blue Eyes got together a lot. What do you remember about that particular night, the atmosphere?
There was such a visceral roar when the fight started to come into focus, the actual fight. It was like a release of atomic proportions in terms of the fans who had been waiting for this for such a long time. And of course, there was a lot of celebrities and politicians at ringside. It was something that was really bigger than big.
Larry, for this fight, you are not going to be quote unquote working media. You are actually getting a ticket. What's that going to be like for you? 'Cause, I mean, let's face it. Now you can cheer.
Well, I've been elevated, physically and otherwise, from being in the media section around the ring to being a fan. So I don't have to be neutral on this event. I'm curious to see how I respond. My normal response is I want to try to figure out what's happening and why it's happening. But at the same time, I may have some visceral reaction myself, depending on how the fight goes.
Larry, you talk about the visceral reaction. After all these years, you've been at Ali Liston 2. You were at Tyson Douglas, a lot of the Ali fights. You know, a lot of the great fights of the 80s with Ray Leonard and Marvin Hagler. Do you still get excited in moments like this as those two gladiators come into the arena?
Sure. You want to see the best against the best. I regard Mayweather as the best pure boxer of his time and Pacquiao as the best fighter of his time.
Mm-hmm. This saga had gone on for, I think, 5 years. I remember at the end of 2009, Miguel Cotto gets stopped by Manny Pacquiao. At that point, that's when the first negotiation took place. Now, this was a never-ending story. As it kept being delayed or backed up or kept dying on the vine, did you ever think to yourself, this fight's gone 6 feet under, it will never happen?
Well, I thought that people kept asking me about it, and I kept telling them, "Why are you asking me? I've always been wrong," because it figured that eventually they would find a way to divide the pie. But yes, there were a couple of times when you thought that the longer this is delayed, that the more possibility that something could happen in or out of the ring. It happened in the ring when Pacquiao got knocked out by Marquez. It happened out of the ring when Mayweather went to prison for domestic abuse. So things can happen. But also what was happening was that in those 5, 6 years, both fighters fought, I think, a total of around 16 pay-per-view fights. They were making a lot of money. And that's a reason in my mind that the differences in the negotiations couldn't be overcome. Mm-hmm. There was no urgency in making the fight because they were making so much money for fighting opponents that they figured to beat. Mm-hmm. And it's also no coincidence in my mind that they overcame the differences when their pay-per-view numbers started to decline.
Mm-hmm. Well, Larry, with that said, that dynamic, one guy's 38, the other guy's 36. I don't recall a time when a quote-unquote super fight had two guys totaling 74 years of age. So the other question is this fight quote-unquote too late? And who was closer to their physical prime, in your opinion?
Well, let's remember that Tyson Lewis also happened in their mid to late 30s.
Okay.
And it's hard to say. They've both been dominant in recent fights. We saw that Pacquiao coming back against a quality fighter in Bradley virtually outclassed him, mm-hmm. So, which says a lot about him, how he came back from the knockout. And Mayweather has continued to beat the best opponents out there. He beat Cotto, he beat Canelo, he beat Maidana, and a fighter like Mayweather normally has a longer shelf life because he doesn't get hit as much. Mm-hmm. But we won't know until they get in there. We won't know if this electrifying moment electrifies them mm-hmm. into being the best possible guys they can still be.
Do you feel that there's a particular advantage for one fighter above the other if they would have fought in 2010 as opposed to 2015?
I sort of think that Pacquiao was more into his prime years at that time and was really dangerous. And I think Mayweather thought that as well.
Well, with that said, would you agree with this statement, Larry? If there's a possibility of a rematch, it only exists if Manny Pacquiao wins, that if Floyd wins, that he's going to take his ball and go home?
It depends on the fight. You know, if Floyd wins and it's an exciting fight and he's made $125 million, why wouldn't he want to do it again? Mm-hmm. So I think it's the important thing is what kind of a fight it is. Mm-hmm. I go into any fight, but especially a big fight, thinking I want this to be so good that by the third round we know we want a rematch.
Right.
You know? Maybe we'll know by the third round.
Larry, with that said, if Mayweather should win this fight in dominant fashion, he's already said, I'm better than Ali, I'm better than Ray Robinson. Now, you're a bit of a historian. You don't like doing lists. What is your reaction as those words come out of his mouth?
As I said, that promoters are salesmen, and he's been a terrific salesman mm-hmm. for himself. And he can say anything he wants. He's not the final judge.
Yeah, you are, Larry. You are. You're one of them. Pacquiao Mayweather, there's a lot of scenarios. I just wonder, can this fight possibly live up to the hype? Because I do believe these guys are getting a lot of money. It's the fight of the decade at the very least. They do have a responsibility, in my opinion, to actually put on a good show. So with that said, can the fight live up to expectations?
Well, let's preface this by saying, look, Mayweather has never felt an obligation to excite fans after the first bell rings. Mm-hmm. Maybe before the fight, he wants to excite fans to come and see what might happen. But when the bell rings, his approach is that he is a virtuoso, a skillful, defensive fighter. But he is coming into this fight as a naturally bigger guy against an opponent who was knocked out. And my guess is that he would like to set a trap in some fashion, that he thinks he can catch Pacquiao on the way in. and land a punch or two punches that can change the fight. That's an advantage he has in terms of size. I think Pacquiao's advantage is that most of the time he has thrown considerably more punches, sometimes 10, 12, 15 punches around than his opponents. If he could do that and get through a 12-round fight, I think it would energize the fans behind him because he's the underdog. He would have won, in a sense, the drama of the fight, and that's a chance for him to win a decision.
Larry, you talked about the economic dynamic that finally forced these two together, but do you think that to a certain degree, Floyd Mayweather, given the parameters of the Showtime deal and how that was working out, do you think that he was cornered into this fight, and should Les Moonves, should he win the Boxing Person of the Year for helping get this done?
Well, I think they gave him an enormous contract with a commitment said to be around $200 million over 6 fights. I don't know, maybe 150 million. I don't know the exact numbers. And I think that some of the numbers, it cost them some money. It was like a lost leader to have Floyd Mayweather, the most famous fighter in America, literally the heavyweight champion of America. Okay, in terms of him as a box office attraction, to help to build the Showtime brand. And there came a time where they probably lost some money on that in terms of him, although maybe it helped the network. And so they had some sway in providing some pressure to make the big fight. But good for them. If they help to make it happen, it's good for them, it's good for us, it's good for the sport.
Larry, thanks for the time.
Thank you, Steve.
This is Steve Kim for UCN Live.